Yao built the foundation, but your sister will be the CEO now, my father announced coldly, his voice echoing in the silent boardroom. I looked at the $500 million valuation on the screen behind him, a number I had bled for over 10 years. I simply nodded, gathered my folders, walked to my car, and made one phone call that would legally dismantle his entire empire by midnight. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family member who tried to steal your success. My name is Hannah, 33 years old, and until that freezing Tuesday morning in Chicago, I was the Chief Operating Officer of Apex Global Logistics. I stood at the head of our sleek glass boardroom table, projecting the third quarter financial report. The numbers were staggering, officially hitting a $500 million valuation. I looked at the board members, their faces reflecting awe. I felt proud, but mostly exhausted. For a decade, I had worked 80-hour weeks, missing holidays, relationships, and sleep, all to drag my father Harrison's outdated, dying trucking company into the modern technology era. When I started, Apex was a dinosaur worth barely $10 million, suffocating under paper invoices and failing trucks. I digitized everything. I built an automated supply chain infrastructure, navigated complex labor negotiations, and sacrificed my entire 20s to save his legacy. I did it because my father had promised me the ultimate reward. He promised that when he retired this year, the CEO title would be mine. As I clicked to the final slide showing our record-breaking profit margins, I smiled at Harrison. He was 65, wearing his custom-tailored suit, looking every bit the proud patriarch. I expected him to stand up, acknowledge my decade of blood, sweat, and tears, and officially pass the torch. Instead, he stood up, adjusted his tie, and cleared his throat. The room went completely silent. "Thank you for the operational updates, Hannah," he said, his tone entirely too formal for a father speaking to his daughter. With Apex Global reaching this historic $500 million milestone, it is time for a transition in leadership. As I step down, we need a visionary who can serve as the global face of this enterprise. I waited, my heart hammering against my ribs. I held my breath, ready for the culmination of 10 years of thankless labor. "That is why," Harrison continued, not looking at me, "I am naming your sister Madison as the new Chief Executive Officer of Apex Global Logistics. And her husband Devin will assume the role of Vice President of Strategic Partnerships." The air rushed out of my lungs. I stared at him, absolutely sure I had misheard. Madison was 29 years old. She had never worked a single day in logistics or operations. Her greatest accomplishment was marrying Devin, a smooth-talking corporate networker, and curating an expensive lifestyle funded entirely by the company credit card I managed and paid off every month. While I was pulling all-nighters writing routing algorithms and dealing with union strikes, she was flying first class to music festivals and posting pictures from luxury resorts. Madison inspected her manicured nails with a bored expression. Devin, sitting beside her, offered me a condescending smile. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the polished mahogany table, exuding unearned confidence. Devin had joined our family 2 years ago, a polished corporate climber who knew exactly how to manipulate older traditional men like my father. I used empty corporate buzzwords without understanding the bare mechanics of how a single delivery truck moved from Chicago to Seattle. He had completely charmed Harrison, convincing him that real business power lay in country club handshakes rather than relentless operational efficiency. "Do not worry," Hannah, Devin said, his voice smooth and dripping with false sympathy. "We still need you on the team. You are great at the technical day-to-day tasks. You will be dropping down to a project manager role to assist Madison during her transition. We just need someone with actual leadership presence at the top to secure international investors." A project manager. A demotion in the company I essentially built from scratch. I looked at my father, waiting for him to correct Devin, waiting for him to defend the daughter who had saved him from bankruptcy when the banks were threatening to foreclose on everything he owned. Harrison simply nodded in agreement with his son-in-law. "Your sister and Devin just had their first baby," Harrison said finally, meeting my eyes with a cold, unapologetic stare. "They need the status and the compensation that comes with executive leadership. You are single, Hannah. You do not have a family to support. You have to understand that family comes first in this business. The betrayal was absolute and suffocating. They were not just stealing my promotion, they were stealing my life's work to fund my sister's vanity and her husband's ego. My father was taking the empire I built and handing it to them on a silver platter, assuming I would just smile, accept my demotion, and continue doing all the heavy lifting in the shadows. He assumed my loyalty to the family would override my own self-respect. I thought I was just a dutiful daughter who would accept being a stepping stone for the golden child without a single word of protest. I did not scream. I did not cry. I looked at the projection screen at the $500 million valuation that existed purely because of a software system I had designed. A system my father fundamentally misunderstood and vastly underestimated. They believed they held all the cards, completely unaware that I held the keys to the entire kingdom. I understand completely, Dad. I said, my voice eerily calm, betraying none of the absolute rage boiling beneath my skin. I reached out and closed my laptop, severing the connection to the projector. The screen behind Harrison went pitch black, a fitting metaphor for what was about to happen to his precious company. I picked up my bag, pushed my chair in, and looked at the three of them with a steady gaze. I will leave the executive decisions to Madison and Devin from now on. Madison will be the new CEO. My father announced, his cold words echoing across the quiet corporate boardroom. Devin will be Vice President, Harrison added, cementing the betrayal I had feared for my entire life. Madison flipped her blonde hair over her shoulder and offered me a look of pure pity. Oh, Hannah, do not be bitter about this. Madison purred, her voice dripping with manufactured sweetness. You have always been so fantastic at the grunt work, the coding, the endless operational errands. You excel at keeping your head down. But Apex Global is entering a new tier now. We need international markets and corporate mergers. The company desperately needs a global face. Someone who understands high-level networking and modern optics. You are just not suited for the spotlight. Beside her, Devin nodded in solemn agreement, placing a comforting hand over hers. Devin was a master of optics. As an African-American strategic consultant with a silver tongue and tailored suits, he had built a career out of looking the part without doing the work. He charmed his way into my father's inner circle 2 years ago, masking his lack of logistical knowledge behind corporate buzzwords like synergy and global integration. He had a history of manipulating aging patriarchs by validating their outdated egos. My father, desperate to feel like a corporate titan rather than a former truck driver, swallowed every piece of flattery Devin served him. Harrison loved showing Devin off at the country club, bragging about his new son-in-law. In reality, Devin was nothing but a parasite ready to bleed dry the massive success I had engineered. He lacked the fundamental skills required to run a supply chain network, yet sat there acting as if he earned his place. I looked at my younger sister, feeling a sudden wave of clarity. The anger that had threatened to boil over instantly evaporated, replaced by an icy resolve. Errand work. I repeated, testing the ridiculous phrase on my tongue. I took a slow step back, resting my hands lightly on my chair, maintaining direct eye contact with Madison. My sister shrank back slightly, the smug smile faltering. Let us get something very clear right now, Madison. I did not do errand work. I wrote every single line of the artificial intelligence supply chain code that took this company from a $10 million failing enterprise to a $500 million empire. I negotiated the union contracts that kept our trucks moving while competitors went bankrupt. I secured the retail partnerships that are currently funding your luxury lifestyle. I leaned in closer, lowering my voice to a sharp register. I built the operational brain of Apex Global Logistics, while you were busy swiping our father's credit card at Coachella and dropping out of your third public relations internship. Do not ever confuse my willingness to work in the trenches with an inability to lead. I am the only reason there is an empire for you to steal. The boardroom remained dead silent. Madison's face flushed a deep crimson, her eyes darting toward our father for protection. Devin's charismatic smile vanished, replaced by a defensive scowl. He opened his mouth to interject, ready to deploy another meaningless phrase, but Harrison slammed his palm against the mahogany table, The loud crack startled everyone in the room except me. "That is enough!" Hannah, my father, barked, twisting his face. "You will not disrespect your sister or your brother-in-law. They are the future of Apex Global. Madison brings the social connections we need, and Devin brings the strategic vision to execute them. Your technical skills are valuable, but leadership requires a different pedigree, a pedigree you simply do not possess." He stood up, attempting to tower over me with the same intimidation tactics he used since we were children. "I am your father, and I am the founder of this company. My word is final. You will step down to senior project manager effective immediately. Your primary responsibility will be to facilitate a smooth transition of power. You will brief Devin on all logistical algorithms, and you will support Madison as she assumes the CEO role. They have a newborn baby to think about. They are building a family legacy. It is your duty to support them and to put the needs of this family above your own selfish pride." I stared at the man who had raised me, the man who demanded my absolute perfection for 3 decades only to discard me the moment I handed him the keys to a kingdom I built. He genuinely believed I would cave. He believed my sense of familial duty would force me to swallow this ultimate humiliation and spend the rest of my career serving as an invisible workhorse for a sister who despised me and a brother-in-law actively conning him. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice, nor did I shed a tear to give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. I picked up my leather briefcase and slung the strap over my shoulder. I looked at the keycard resting on the table, the small piece of plastic that granted access to the executive suites, the server rooms, and the highly classified data centers I had designed. "Good luck with your global face," I said softly, looking right past my father and directly into Devin's anxious eyes. "I hope your strategic vision knows how to write Python code." Without waiting for a response, I walked toward the heavy glass doors. Harrison shouted my name, his voice echoing off the walls, demanding that I come back to my seat, demanding that I accept my new role. I ignored him. I pushed through the double doors and stepped out into the bustling executive hallway, leaving my family behind. My heart beat with a steady precision. They thought they had just staged a brilliant corporate coup, completely oblivious to the reality that they had just initiated their own absolute destruction. The heavy glass doors swung shut behind me, sealing my family inside the boardroom. I barely took 10 steps down the carpeted executive hallway when the intercom system above my head crackled to life. Devin had not wasted a single second. I could hear his smooth, commanding voice echoing through the corridor, directing the head of IT. "Terminate all administrative access for the Chief Operating Officer immediately. Lock her out of the mainframes, disable her keycards, and wipe her mobile permissions. Do it right now." He was moving fast, eager to secure his unearned throne before I could sabotage his stolen kingdom. I kept walking, my pace steady. I reached my office, a space I had practically lived in for the past decade, and reached for my door handle. A heavy hand clamped down on my shoulder. I turned to find the head of building security standing there with 2 large guards flanking him. He looked deeply uncomfortable. His eyes darted away from mine. "I am sorry, Hannah." He mumbled, his voice tight with regret. "The new vice president just called down to the desk. He ordered us to escort you out of the building immediately. You are not allowed to enter your office. You are not allowed to touch your computer." I looked at the security chief, a man whose pension plan I had personally saved 2 years ago. I did not blame him. He was just trying to keep his job under a new volatile regime. "Devin wants to make a public spectacle," I stated flatly. The guard nodded, his face flushing red with shame. "He specifically requested we march you through the main operational bullpen. He said it was standard procedure for terminated executives." Terminated. The word hung heavily in the air. My father had not bothered to clarify that I was demoted to a project manager. He had simply let Devin unleash his ego and fire me outright. It was a power play designed to break my spirit and establish total dominance. I handed the guard my corporate ID badge. "Lead the way," I said. We walked toward the main operational floor. The bullpen was a massive open-plan space housing over 200 logistics coordinators, dispatchers, and data analysts. I personally interviewed and hired almost everyone in that room. As I stepped onto the floor, flanked by 2 security guards, The normal chaotic roar of ringing phones and shouting dispatchers died instantly. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the room. 200 heads turned to watch me. I kept my chin high, my posture perfectly straight. I refused to look at the ground. I looked directly into the eyes of the people I had led through global supply chain crises. I saw shock, confusion, and rising panic in their faces. My lead data analyst stood up from her desk, her hand covering her mouth. Devin stepped out from a side corridor, positioning himself on the elevated walkway overlooking the bullpen. He wanted to watch his handiwork. He wanted to see me humiliated. He stood there with his arms crossed, an arrogant smirk plastered across his face, making sure every employee saw exactly who held the power now. I did not flinch. I did not speed up my pace. I walked the entire length of the bullpen with the grace of a queen, surveying her realm one last time. When we reached the security desk at the front lobby, the receptionist handed me my personal purse. Devin had ordered someone to pack it and bring it down. They had confiscated my laptop, my legal notebooks, and even my personal framed photographs. I took the purse without a single word of complaint, pushed through the heavy revolving glass doors, and stepped out into the biting Chicago wind. The security guards stopped at the property line, watching me walk across the asphalt parking lot toward my car. They expected me to crumble. They expected the weight of a decade of wasted loyalty to force me to my knees. They assumed my identity was entirely tied to the title my father had just ripped away. When I reached my vehicle, a black sedan I bought with my own funds, I unlocked the door and slid into the driver's seat. The heavy door clicked shut, sealing me inside a quiet sanctuary. I gripped the leather steering wheel. I looked up at the towering glass facade of the Apex Global building. On the fifth floor, I could see Devin standing by the window, looking down, waiting eagerly for me to break down completely. Instead of crying, a slow, icy smile spread across my face. I reached into my purse and pulled out my personal cell phone, a device disconnected from the Apex network. Devin had locked me out of the servers, unaware that the company did not own the software they were running on. I dialed a direct number for my private wealth management team. The phone rang twice before a professional voice answered the line. "Good morning, Hannah. How can we assist you with your accounts today?" I leaned back against the headrest, keeping my eyes fixed on Devin's dark silhouette above. "Initiate Protocol 0. I commanded, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "Liquidate the secondary market accounts and prepare the acquisition funds immediately. The transition is happening ahead of schedule." The voice on the other end remained perfectly calm. "Understood. We will have the required capital ready for deployment within 48 hours. I ended the call and tossed the phone onto the passenger seat. My family thought they had won. They thought they had removed the only threat to their corporate vanity. They were inside celebrating a victory, totally blind to the fact that they were standing on a trapdoor I had wired to explode years ago. I started the heavy engine, shifted into gear, and drove away from the company I built, completely ready to sit back and watch it all burn to the ground. I navigated through the heavy Chicago traffic, my mind operating with the cold precision of the algorithms I had coded. I pulled into the underground parking garage of my luxury downtown condominium. The building was a sleek fortress of glass and steel overlooking the river, a physical manifestation of my corporate success. I took the private elevator up to the penthouse level. When the doors parted, I stepped into my sanctuary. It was a sprawling 3,000 square foot space, with floor-to-ceiling windows, custom marble countertops, and a quiet elegance I had carefully curated to escape the noise of the logistics world. I dropped my purse on the kitchen island and poured myself a glass of water. I stood by the window watching the city lights begin to flicker on against the twilight sky. The silence in the apartment was usually comforting, but tonight it felt heavy with anticipation. I knew the fallout from my termination had not concluded. My family was entirely too predictable. They never settled for a single victory when total destruction was an option. Right on cue, my cell phone vibrated against the marble counter. The caller ID flashed my mother's name, Catherine. I let it ring 3 times before sliding my finger across the screen to accept the call. "Hello, Mom," I answered, my tone neutral. I expected screaming. I expected her to berate me for walking out of the boardroom and disrespecting my father in front of Devon. Instead, her voice was clipped businesslike and entirely devoid of maternal warmth. Hannah, we need to discuss your living arrangements, Catherine stated, skipping any pretense of a greeting or an inquiry into my emotional state after losing a decade of my life's work. I took a slow sip of water. Go on. You know your father technically holds the deed to that condominium? She continued, her voice gaining an edge of righteous authority. We bought it under the Apex corporate real estate portfolio for tax purposes. Since you are no longer an active executive at the company, you no longer qualify for corporate housing benefits. I closed my eyes, a bitter laugh dying in the back of my throat. I had paid the mortgage on this condo every single month for 6 years straight. My father simply kept his name on the paperwork to leverage the asset for corporate loans. He had used my home as collateral, and now my mother was using it as a weapon. They were systematically stripping away every piece of my life. I need you to vacate the premises by the end of the week, Catherine demanded. Madison and Devon are coming over tonight to take measurements for the nursery. I gripped the edge of the counter. Measurements for a nursery. The audacity was breathtaking. They were not just evicting me, they were giving my home to the sister who had just stolen my career. Madison and Devon are expecting a baby, Catherine explained, misinterpreting my silence as shock. They need the space, Hannah. Their current townhouse is simply too small for a growing family, and it does not have the right security for a chief executive officer. You are 33 years old and single. You do not need a place that big all to yourself. Be a good sister and step aside. It is the right thing to do for the family. The sheer toxicity of her justification hung in the air. In my sister's manufactured success, and her unborn child completely negated my existence. Because I had sacrificed my personal life to build the family empire, I was now deemed unworthy of the home I had paid for. I was just a solitary, expendable piece on their chessboard, expected to quietly slide off the board whenever they needed more room. Catherine waited for my explosion. She waited for the tears, the screaming, the desperate pleading. She thrived on emotional chaos and loved playing the victim when I finally snapped under the pressure of their impossible demands. But I was done playing their game. Okay, I said softly. The word dropped into the phone line like a stone into a quiet pond. There was a long, hollow pause on the other end. What did you say? Catherine asked, her voice faltering, clearly thrown completely off balance by my immediate compliance. I said, okay, Mom. I will pack my things. You do not need to wait until the end of the week. Madison and Devon can have the condo tonight. The line went dead silent. My absolute surrender unnerved her more than a screaming match ever could. She stuttered, trying to find a reason to argue, trying to extract the emotional reaction she craved, but I gave her nothing. I will leave the keys on the kitchen counter. I added, my voice smooth and untroubled. Tell Madison congratulations on the nursery. I ended the call and placed the phone face down. I did not shed a single tear. I did not throw a glass against the wall. I simply walked into my massive walk-in closet, pulled down 2 large suitcases, and began meticulously packing my clothes. I moved through the empty, echoing rooms of the luxury penthouse in the middle of the night, taking only what I absolutely needed. I left the expensive furniture, the imported art, and the fully stocked kitchen. Every single item I willingly abandoned was another physical tie completely severed from their manipulative grasp. The deep silence of the apartment wrapped tightly around me, feeling far less like a sudden prison and much more like a profound, unexpected freedom. I knew exactly what would inevitably happen next without me. I zipped the suitcases shut, rolled them to the front door, and placed my silver keycard squarely on the marble island. I walked out into the hallway, leaving the door unlocked behind me, stepping into the dark with a calm, terrifying certainty that my family had just sealed their own fate. The very next evening, the fake empire celebrated its stolen crown. Madison and Devon did not waste a single second burning through the company reserves to validate their new titles. They threw a lavish company-funded launch party to usher in what they called the new era of Apex Global Logistics. They rented out the grand ballroom of a luxury Chicago hotel, transforming it into a monument to their own vanity. There were towering ice sculptures carved into the shape of cargo ships, endless trays of imported caviar, and a live jazz band playing in the corner. Madison glided across the marble floor in a custom designer gown that cost more than a dispatcher's annual salary, heavily pregnant and soaking up the adoration of the city's elite. Devon worked the room in a velvet dinner jacket, gripping a glass of expensive champagne, delivering hollow speeches to investors about synergy, global integration, and forward momentum. They were playing dress-up with my life's work, flaunting their unearned power to a room full of people who cared only about the free liquor. I knew exactly what was happening because my phone would not stop vibrating. While Madison and Devon were popping champagne, my mother was busy orchestrating a synchronized smear campaign. Extended family members, aunts, uncles, and cousins I had not spoken to in years, began flooding my phone with text messages. They called me bitter. They called me selfish. "How could you not show up to support your own sister on the biggest night of her life?" one aunt wrote. Another cousin chimed in, saying my jealousy was tearing the family apart. Madison, never one to miss an opportunity for public sympathy, took to her social media accounts. She posted a heavily filtered photo of herself and Devon clinking glasses, accompanied by a long, passive-aggressive caption about protecting her peace and removing toxic negative energy from the family business. She painted herself as the brave, visionary leader, stepping out of the shadows of a jealous, difficult older sister. The narrative was perfectly spun. In their eyes, I was the villain who had thrown a tantrum and abandoned the family simply because I was not handed the top job. Devon stood at the center of the ballroom holding a microphone. He toasted my father, who sat at the head table beaming with pride. Harrison looked at Devon with the admiration he had never once directed toward me. Devon spoke about moving away from the dusty, outdated logistics models of the past, subtly digging at my decade of relentless optimization. He promised the investors that Apex Global was going to become a lifestyle brand, a tech-forward disruptor in the global supply chain. The crowd applauded, completely unaware that Devon could not even explain the basic difference between freight forwarding and domestic freight brokering. Madison stood beside him, resting a hand on her baby bump, playing the perfect corporate matriarch. My mother, Catherine, circulated through the crowd, making sure everyone knew that her youngest daughter was a prodigy who had finally stepped up to save the company from my supposed mismanagement. They were rewriting history in real time, erasing my late nights, my sacrifices, and my absolute dedication. I read every single message. I looked at every single post, and I did not feel an ounce of guilt. I was miles away from their circus, sitting in a stunning, undisclosed penthouse, overlooking the dark expanse of Lake Michigan. The funds I had liquidated earlier that morning had moved with lightning speed, securing me a sprawling, ultra-modern sanctuary high above the city skyline. The space was sleek, quiet, and completely impenetrable. I sat on a plush velvet sofa, wearing a comfortable silk robe, sipping a glass of vintage red wine that tasted like pure vindication. The contrast between my reality and their illusion was sharp. They were surrounded by hundreds of fake friends, desperately seeking validation. I was entirely alone, wrapped in the quiet confidence of a woman who held all the cards. I did not reply to a single message from my relatives. I simply blocked their numbers one by one. I severed the digital ties just as easily as I had abandoned the furniture in my old condominium. I set my wine glass down on the glass coffee table and reached for my computer. It was a master laptop, heavily encrypted and entirely disconnected from the Apex Global corporate network. Devon and his IT team had locked me out of the company mainframes, but they had absolutely no idea that the mainframes were tethered to a completely separate entity. I opened the laptop and logged into the administrative dashboard of Nexus Code. The screen glowed in the dim light of the penthouse, displaying the real-time data flow of the entire Apex logistics network. I could see every truck, every warehouse scan, every automated routing decision. Through the dashboard, I accessed the central financial ledger of Apex Global. I watched in real time as the corporate credit cards were swiped at the hotel bar. $5,000 for premium liquor, $10,000 for a private photographer. They were bleeding the operational budget dry to fund a party celebrating their own theft. "Let them have their party," I whispered to the empty room. "Let them drink the champagne. The bill is going to be devastating." The hangover from the lavish launch party faded, but the reckless arrogance of the new leadership only accelerated. Within a week, the brutal reality of their incompetence began to infect the company. Devon, drunk on his unearned authority and terrified of anyone who actually understood the business, initiated a massive purge. He targeted my most loyal veteran logistics managers. These were the men and women who had worked by my side in the trenches for years, the people who knew the intricate mechanics of the supply chain inside and out. Devon called them into his newly redecorated corner office one by one. He fired the head of domestic dispatch, a woman with 20 years of impeccable service, claiming her methods were not aligned with his new strategic vision. He terminated the regional warehouse directors, replacing them with his unqualified fraternity brothers from college. Suddenly, the executive suites were filled with men who held degrees in sports marketing and public relations, men who spent their days playing indoor golf in their offices, while pulling down exorbitant six-figure salaries. They wore expensive suits and used trendy corporate buzzwords, but they had absolutely no idea how to manage a global logistics network. Devon was systematically tearing out the structural pillars of the company to build a monument to his own ego. It did not take long for the cracks in the ice to show. An artificial intelligence supply chain is a living, breathing organism. It requires constant monitoring, subtle adjustments, and experienced human oversight to handle unpredictable variables like severe weather patterns or sudden port closures. Devon's new team of amateur executives completely ignored the daily diagnostic reports. They did not know how to read them, so they simply deleted the emails. By the end of the second week, the warehouse floors started experiencing minor yet compounding glitches. The automated barcode scanners in the main Chicago hub began lagging by 2 seconds per scan. It seemed insignificant to a marketing major, but in high-speed logistics, a 2-second delay across 50,000 packages a day created a massive bottleneck. Delivery trucks were held up at the loading docks. Drivers were forced to wait in the freezing cold because the routing software had not been updated with the proper gate clearances. Packages began piling up. The delicate, highly synchronized machine I had built was starting to cough and sputter under the weight of pure neglect. Instead of addressing the operational fires spreading across the warehouse floors, the new management completely ignored the warning signs. Devon was entirely focused on optics. He flew to New York City with Madison, bringing a team of expensive photographers to document their meetings with a massive international retail conglomerate. They were pushing for a new multi-million-dollar contract that would supposedly double the company valuation. Devon was obsessed with signing the deal to prove to my father that he was a genius. He ignored the frantic emails from the lower-level dispatchers begging for technical support. He instructed his new executive team to silence any complaints from the warehouse managers, demanding that everyone focus strictly on positive momentum and the upcoming retail partnership. The structural integrity of Apex Global was crumbling beneath their feet, but they were too busy looking at the stars to notice the ground giving way. As the chaos slowly mounted, my phone rang. It was not my family this time. It was the former employees, the veterans Devon had fired, and the few remaining loyalists who were trapped inside the sinking ship began calling my private number. The head of regional dispatch called me in a sheer panic, explaining that the routing algorithms were drifting, and the new executives refused to approve the overtime needed to manually fix the backlog. He begged me to intervene. He asked me to call my father to talk some sense into the board to come back and fix the systems before the entire network collapsed. I listened to his frantic voice, feeling a deep pang of sympathy for the hardworking people caught in the crossfire of my family's greed. But I could not save them without saving the people who had betrayed me. "I am sorry," I told him, my voice calm and steady. "I no longer work for Apex Global. I have absolutely no authority to access the servers or authorize operational changes. You need to direct your concerns to the new vice president." The dispatcher groaned in frustration, telling me that Devon was unreachable in New York. Listen to me very carefully, I said, leaning forward in my penthouse looking out at the gathering storm clouds over the lake. Do not try to be a hero. Do not work unpaid overtime to fix their mistakes. Take your severance package, cash the check immediately, and update your resume. The company is heading into a wall, and you do not want to be in the passenger seat when it hits. I hung up the phone and placed it on the glass table. I did not intervene. I maintained my absolute silence. My family wanted to fly the plane completely unaware that I had packed the only parachute. The minor glitches were just the beginning. The real storm was brewing, dark and violent on the horizon, and I was perfectly content to watch them sail directly into the center of it. I watched the storm clouds gather over Lake Michigan, the dark water reflecting the exact turbulent energy I knew was tearing through the Apex Global headquarters. My phone had finally stopped ringing, the frantic pleas of former colleagues replaced by the cold, heavy silence of impending consequence. I stepped away from the window, walked over to my marble kitchen island, and opened my secure master laptop. It was time to initiate the final phase of a plan I had quietly set in motion almost a decade ago. I opened a private encrypted communication channel and dialed my lead corporate attorney, Vincent. He answered on the first ring, his voice crisp and strictly professional. "Good evening, Hannah," Vincent said. "I assume the new executive team has officially finalized your termination paperwork." I took a seat on the velvet stool and pulled up a heavily encrypted digital file on my screen. "They finalized it 3 days ago, Vincent," I replied. "My father signed the demotion order, and Devon executed the total system lockout. They marched me out of the building with security." "Perfect," Vincent replied, a hint of dark satisfaction bleeding into his usually stoic tone. "Then the trap is officially primed." To understand the sheer magnitude of the trap my family had blindly walked into, you have to look back exactly 8 years. 8 years ago, Apex Global Logistics was bleeding money. My father was running the company into the ground using carbon copy invoices, analog dispatch radios, and gut feelings instead of actual data. We were losing massive contracts to modernized competitors, and bankruptcy was no longer a threat. It was a mathematical certainty. I saw the writing on the wall. I spent 6 months developing a comprehensive pitch for a proprietary artificial intelligence routing software. I stayed up for consecutive nights writing the foundational code, running the simulations, and building a flawless proof of concept. I took the presentation to my father, begging him to invest the remaining company capital into the technology. I showed him how the software could instantly optimize delivery routes, predict weather delays, and cut fuel costs by 30% across the entire national fleet. He barely looked at this presentation. He threw my binder across his desk, calling my work tech garbage. He told me that logistics was a man's game built on firm handshakes and diesel fuel, not computer screens. He refused to fund a single dime of the project. But I knew the software worked. I knew it was the only thing that could save the family legacy. So I did not argue. I quietly walked out of his office and took matters into my own hands. I liquidated my own modest savings account. I took out massive personal loans that kept me awake in cold sweats for years. I secretly funded and built the entire software infrastructure myself, completely off the Apex Global grid. Because I used my own personal capital and developed the code entirely on my own time, using personal equipment, I retained absolute, undeniable legal ownership of the intellectual property. I registered the software under a completely independent private limited liability company called Nexus Code. My name was the sole signature on the founding documents. Apex Global Logistics did not own a single line of the code. They never did. When I finally launched the software and integrated it into the Apex network, the results were instantaneous and explosive. The company went from the brink of total financial collapse to generating unprecedented profit margins within 3 financial quarters. My father gladly took all the credit at the country club, bragging about his brilliant corporate turnaround. He simply assumed the technology was property of the company because I was his daughter. He never bothered to read the fine print of the operational agreements I placed on his desk. He never realized that Apex Global had been operating on a heavily discounted year-to-year licensing agreement. For 8 years, I personally signed off on the renewal every single January. to keep my father's company afloat. I basically gave them the world-class software for pennies on the dollar out of a misplaced sense of family loyalty. But the licensing agreement had extremely specific stipulations regarding system access and administrative control. Stipulations that Vincent and I were currently reviewing on our screens. I brought up the contract file, Vincent, I said, tracing the glowing text on my monitor. Section 4, paragraph 2. Vincent read the clause aloud, his voice echoing in the quiet penthouse. If the primary administrative liaison, legally defined as Hannah, is forcibly removed from network access or terminated without absolute just cause, the discounted year-to-year licensing agreement is immediately rendered void. The automatic renewal clause is cancelled, and operational usage rights expire 72 hours after the termination event. I smiled at the monitor. Devin locked me out of the servers at exactly 9 in the morning on Friday. He legally voided their access. What is our exact timeline, Vincent? The attorney typed rapidly on his keyboard. The 72-hour grace period expires at exactly midnight tonight. At 1 minute past midnight on Monday, their usage rights evaporate. Any continued operation of the Nexus Code software by Apex Global Logistics becomes a federal act of corporate theft and unauthorized access. My family was currently spending hundreds of thousands of dollars they did not have celebrating a $500 million valuation that was built entirely on a rented foundation. They were throwing lavish parties, firing my loyal staff, and strutting around the executive suites like conquering heroes. They were completely oblivious to the fact that the actual engine driving their entire empire did not belong to them, and the lease was about to expire in a matter of hours. Are the injunctions prepared? I asked Vincent, feeling a surge of adrenaline replacing the exhaustion of the past decade. The paperwork is finalized and ready for immediate deployment, Vincent confirmed. The cease and desist orders will be automatically filed with the federal courts the moment the clock strikes midnight. We have the digital kill switches primed on the main servers. All we need is your final authorization to execute the blackout. Keep the servers running until tomorrow morning. I instructed, a cold strategy forming in my mind. Madison and Devin are hosting a massive press conference in the main lobby at 10 in the morning to announce their new international retail partnership. They invited every major financial reporter in the city. I want the system to fail when the cameras are rolling. I want the entire industry to watch their fake empire crumble in real time. Understood, Vincent said. Enjoy your evening, Hannah. Tomorrow is going to be extremely chaotic for your father. I closed the encrypted channel and shut the laptop, listening to the heavy rain finally begin to lash against the glass windows of the penthouse, knowing that by tomorrow morning, my toxic family would finally realize the true cost of their absolute betrayal. The rain lashed against the glass windows of my penthouse, mirroring the storm I had just unleashed. I poured the rest of my wine into the sink and walked over to the massive dining table where I had spread out the physical copies of the original Nexus Code founding documents. Vincent and I had reviewed the digital files, but seeing the ink on the paper solidified the reality of what was about to happen. I ran my fingers over the corporate seal. My family believed I was just a glorified errand girl, but they were about to collide with a legal trap I had meticulously built exactly 8 years ago. Back then, when Harrison first rejected my pitch for the artificial intelligence tracking system, calling it tech garbage, he practically handed me the greatest opportunity of my entire life. He was so arrogant, so utterly convinced that his outdated methods were superior, that he completely dismissed the future of his own industry. When he refused to fund the project, he legally absolved the company of any intellectual property claims. But I knew the logistics company was days away from total bankruptcy. I could not just let my grandfather's original legacy die. So the grueling solo hustle began. I did not just work my regular 80-hour weeks for Apex Global. I worked an additional 40 hours in absolute secret. I sold my car, a vintage Mustang I loved, just to afford the initial server space. I moved out of a comfortable apartment and into a cramped, unheated studio above a loud diner in a terrible neighborhood, so I could pour every single dime of my salary into development costs. I drank cheap black coffee and coded until my fingers cramped and my vision completely blurred. I hired freelance cybersecurity experts under strict non-disclosure agreements to stress test the architecture. I built the entire system from the ground up entirely on my own, while my sister Madison was taking expensive gap years in Europe on our father's dime. When the software was finally functional and completely bug-free, I took the most crucial step of the entire process. I incorporated Nexus Code as a completely independent limited liability company registered in Delaware. I structured the ownership so that my name was the sole beneficiary, entirely firewalled from Apex Global Logistics. My father never asked how the new system was actually built. He was just thrilled when our profit margins suddenly skyrocketed. When I placed the operational contracts on his desk, he signed them without reading a single page. He assumed I had built the technology on company time using company resources. He never realized that Apex Global never actually owned the software. They were essentially renting the engine that kept their trucks moving. I picked up the licensing agreement from the table. It was a masterpiece of legal protection. I had specifically structured it as a heavily discounted year-to-year lease. I did that originally to protect my intellectual property from my father's creditors in case the company went under anyway. The terms were absolutely explicit. Apex Global paid a nominal monthly fee for usage rights, but Nexus Code retained absolute administrative control and ownership of the source code. My father was so thrilled by the low cost that he never questioned the underlying structure. For 8 years, I personally signed off on the renewal, essentially subsidizing his empire out of a misplaced sense of familial duty. I kept my father looking like a genius, and in return, he handed my company to my sister. I gathered the documents and locked them inside a fireproof safe hidden in the wall of the penthouse. The legal trap was perfectly set, and Devin had walked right into it by firing me and locking me out of the system. He voided the lease. He pulled the pin on a grenade without understanding what it actually was. I walked into my bedroom and set my alarm for 6 in the morning. I needed a few hours of sleep before the real chaos began. Monday morning arrived with brilliant cold Chicago sunlight piercing through the floor-to-ceiling windows. My alarm buzzed, but I was already awake. I stepped into the shower, letting the hot water clear the final traces of exhaustion from my mind. Today was the day the grand illusion shattered. I walked into my expansive closet and selected a razor-sharp tailored charcoal suit. This was not the outfit of a demoted project manager. This was the armor of a chief executive officer preparing to reclaim her stolen territory. I paired it with a crisp white blouse and a pair of classic black stilettos. I pulled my hair back into a sleek, severe style, completely eliminating any trace of the soft, compliant daughter they expected me to be. I walked back into the living room and opened my secure laptop. It was 8 in the morning. Down at the Apex Global headquarters, the lobby was undoubtedly buzzing with frantic energy. Madison and Devin were scheduled to host their massive press conference in exactly 2 hours. They had invited industry journalists, financial analysts, and the top executives from the international retail conglomerate they were desperately trying to partner with. They were going to stand on a stage, smile for the cameras, and take credit for the $500 million valuation they had absolutely nothing to do with building. They were going to use my life's work as a prop to validate their unearned status. I accessed the Nexus Code administrative dashboard. The system was running flawlessly, processing thousands of routing commands across the national network. I could see the digital heartbeat of 5,000 trucks currently navigating the highways. I poured a hot cup of black coffee and sat at the kitchen island. I pulled up the live security feed of the Apex Global lobby on my secondary monitor. They had exactly 1 hour left before the rented foundation collapsed completely. I stared at the secondary monitor, watching the silent, high-definition security feed of the Apex Global lobby. The digital clock in the corner of the screen ticked down. 9 in the morning. They were running around like royalty preparing for a coronation, completely blind to the guillotine hanging directly above their heads. Over the weekend, while I was meticulously reviewing hundreds of pages of legal injunctions with Vincent, my family was busy spending money they did not actually have. Through my access to the central financial ledger, I watched them drain the corporate accounts in a sheer frenzy of unearned greed. Devin purchased 2 imported sports cars on Saturday, charging the massive down payments directly to the Apex executive expense account. Madison went on a high-end designer shopping spree, outfitting herself for the press conference as if she were walking a Hollywood red carpet. They were burning through capital to project an illusion of unstoppable success. Their arrogance was their absolute undoing. Devin thought he was executing a brilliant corporate power play when he ordered the IT department to lock me out of the servers. He wanted to humiliate me. He wanted to ensure I could not sabotage his new reign. But in his desperate rush to assert dominance, he fundamentally misunderstood the legal architecture of the company he was trying to steal. By forcibly removing my administrative access, Devin triggered the absolute termination clause embedded deep within the Nexus Code licensing agreement. It was not just a matter of me losing my job. It was a severe breach of contract. The agreement explicitly mandated that my continuous access was the single binding condition for the discounted corporate rate. The exact second my keycard was deactivated and my passwords were wiped, the automatic renewal clause was instantly voided. The ticking clock started right then, counting down a mandatory 72-hour grace period before total expiration. That grace period expired at exactly midnight on Monday. Last night, as the clock struck 12, I sat in this exact spot on an open line with Vincent. We watched the digital timestamp cross over into Monday, officially transforming Apex Global Logistics from a licensed client into an unauthorized entity, committing massive corporate theft. Every single route calculated, every barcode scanned, and every automated dispatch triggered after midnight was a direct violation of federal intellectual property laws. They were operating a stolen $500 million machine. Vincent had the heavy legal artillery locked and loaded. The injunctions were drafted, signed, and time-stamped. The cease and desist orders were queued in the federal electronic filing system, ready to be blasted to my father, my sister, and the board of directors. It was a flawless legal trap, executed with zero margin for error. I could have shut down the servers in the dead of night, leaving warehouse managers to panic in the dark. But that would have allowed Devin and Madison to hide the failure. They would have spun a lie, blaming a temporary server outage, desperately scrambling behind the scenes to fix a problem they could not comprehend. I did not want a quiet malfunction. I wanted a total, undeniable public execution of their fake empire. I wanted the people they were trying to impress to watch them fall, so I deliberately kept the servers running. I let the trucks roll out for the morning shifts. I let the international retail executives arrive at the headquarters. I let my family set up the stage, the microphones, and the massive projection screens in the lobby. I gave them enough rope to ensure they could never untangle themselves. The calm before the storm in my penthouse was absolute. I took another sip of my black coffee. On the monitor, the Apex lobby was filling up rapidly. I saw reporters from major financial news outlets setting up their tripods. I saw the executives from the international retail conglomerate standing near the front, dressed in immaculate suits, chatting amiably with my father. Harrison looked completely in his element, shaking hands, playing the brilliant founder who had successfully transitioned his legacy to the next generation. Then Madison and Devin descended the grand staircase. Devin was wearing a custom-tailored suit. Madison was glowing, waving to the cameras, soaking in the attention. They looked like the perfect corporate power couple ready to sign a contract to secure their wealth. Devin stepped up to the podium, tapping the microphone to ensure it was working. He smiled, that same hollow smile he used to manipulate my father, and began speaking to the crowd. I could not hear his exact words, but I did not need to. I knew he was spewing empty corporate jargon about synergy and a bold new era for the business. He was taking credit for my 10 years of grueling sacrifice while I watched from a secure location miles away. The retail executives nodded along, thoroughly convinced by the polished presentation. They were just minutes away from signing a massive distribution contract based entirely on the capabilities of my software. I checked the digital clock on my dashboard. 9:58. 2 minutes left before their stolen corporate fantasy collapsed entirely. I thought about the long decade of missed birthdays, the exhausted nights sleeping under my desk, and the complete lack of gratitude from my own blood. My hands rested over the keyboard. The Nexus Code Master control panel was open on my primary screen. A single glowing red icon sat in the center of the dashboard, labeled to execute the system blackout. I watched my father beam with pride on the live feed. I watched my sister pose for a photograph. I watched the man who stole my career prepare to sign a document he had absolutely no power to fulfill. The trap was perfectly set. The legal paperwork was filed. The cameras were rolling. The fake empire had reached its absolute peak, and I was about to drop it right off a cliff. The digital clock on my monitor flipped to exactly 9:59. Through the high-definition live feed, I watched Devin raise both of his hands to quiet the murmuring crowd of journalists and corporate executives gathered in the Apex Global lobby. Dozens of flashbulbs erupted, casting a harsh strobe light effect across the massive multi-story glass atrium I had personally designed 5 years ago. Behind Devon, the gigantic projection screens that usually displayed my real-time logistical heat maps were currently frozen on a branded graphic celebrating the new global partnership. The top executives from the international retail conglomerate stood in the front row looking incredibly pleased. They were a ruthless group of investors who demanded absolute operational perfection, completely unaware that the man currently pitching them was a glorified con artist, playing with a stolen machine he did not know how to operate. My father stepped up to the podium, placing a heavy, affectionate hand on Devon's shoulder. Harrison leaned directly into the microphone, his booming voice echoing through the massive lobby and out of my laptop speakers. "I am incredibly proud to stand before you today," my father declared, projecting the image of a seasoned titan of industry. "For decades, Apex Global has been a family business built on hard work. But to survive in the modern era, you need fearless, innovative leadership. You need true vision. That is exactly what my son-in-law Devin and my brilliant daughter Madison bring to the table. They are the true architects of this new era. They have modernized this company and secured our future on the global stage." I listened to the applause thunder through the speakers of my laptop. The sheer audacity of his words was staggering. Architects of a new era. Madison and Devon had absolutely not built a single thing in their entire lives. My father was standing in front of the world, erasing my entire existence from the company history. He was rewriting a decade of my grueling sacrifice, taking the software infrastructure I had bled to build and handing the total credit to a man who had been with the company for 24 months. He did not mention my name a single time. He did not mention the endless nights, the sacrificed weekends, or the sheer operational genius required to push his failing trucking company into a $500 million valuation. I was effectively ghosted from my own legacy, replaced by a more palatable, compliant version of the family he preferred to showcase to the world. Madison took the microphone next, looking radiant in her designer gown. She spoke softly, playing the humble visionary, thanking our father for his trust, and expressing her excitement about the multi-million-dollar distribution contract sitting on the podium. She talked about empowering women in the corporate space, a deeply ironic statement, considering she had actively participated in stripping her own sister of a hard-earned executive title just a few days prior. The retail executives nodded in approval, completely charmed by the performance. A sleek silver pen was produced from a velvet box by an assistant. Devon and Madison positioned themselves on either side of the podium, ready to sign the documents that would legally obligate Apex Global to deliver millions of units across the country, using a software system they no longer had the right to access. I carefully checked the time. It was exactly 9:59 and 45 seconds. 15 seconds left before total collapse. I reached across the marble of the kitchen island and picked up my cell phone. I bypassed the standard contacts list and dialed a secure direct line to the lead development team at Nexus Code. These were the brilliant software engineers I had personally hired and hidden away in a secondary off-site office space, disconnected from the Apex corporate network. They were fiercely loyal to me, disgusted by Devon's amateur takeover and firings, and they had been waiting eagerly on standby since the servers crossed into illegal territory at midnight. The phone rang exactly once before my lead engineer answered the secure line. "Good morning, Hannah," the lead engineer said, his voice thrumming with intense, focused energy. "We are watching the live stream of the press conference right now. The deployment protocols are primed. We have bypassed all of Devon's localized security measures. The servers are ready for the immediate purge sequence on your command." I kept my eyes locked on the live feed. Madison was holding the silver pen, hovering it right above the signature line of the retail contract. Flashbulbs were going off in a blinding wave of corporate celebration. 10 seconds, I said softly into the phone, my voice completely steady. My father was smiling wider than I had ever seen him smile in my entire life. He thought he had finally won. He thought he had successfully secured his legacy and permanently discarded the daughter he deemed unworthy of the spotlight. 5 seconds, the engineer counted down on the other end of the line. 4, 3. Madison confidently touched the fine tip of the silver pen to the thick, expensive paper of the contract. The retail executives leaned in closer, ready to shake hands and solidify the massive global partnership. Devin looked out at the crowd of reporters, puffing his chest out proudly, a man completely intoxicated by his own unearned power and totally oblivious to the catastrophic reality hurtling toward him at light speed. 2, 1. Execute the total system blackout immediately, I commanded. I did not raise my voice at all. I did not shout in sudden, arrogant triumph. I delivered the final, devastating order with the cold, calculated precision of an executioner pulling a heavy lever. I set the phone down gently on the marble counter and leaned closer to the high-definition monitor. The exact moment the word left my mouth, the grand illusion shattered, and the fake empire died instantly. The phone was still active on the marble counter. I leaned closer to the microphone. Just to be absolutely clear, I said, my dialogue razor sharp and cold. Pull the plug. Shut it all down. A sharp keystroke echoed through the speaker. It is done, the engineer replied. I watched the live feed on my high-definition monitor. Madison had just completed her signature on the first page of the multi-million-dollar distribution contract. She lifted the silver pen, flashing a radiant, victorious smile and the wall of flashing cameras. Devin was mid-sentence, delivering a triumphant speech about uninterrupted global synergy. In that exact fraction of a second, the massive digital infrastructure of Apex Global Logistics simply ceased to exist. Behind Devin, the gigantic 50-foot projection screens that spanned the entire lobby flickered violently. The vibrant branded graphics, celebrating the new international partnership, warped into static. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd of journalists and investors as the screens simultaneously flashed a blinding, violent red. The sudden shift in lighting bathed the entire atrium in the color of a severe emergency. Devin spun around, his arrogant smile freezing as the microphone in his hand emitted a piercing shriek of feedback before going completely dead. This was not a localized glitch. The kill switch I just authorized cascaded through the entire national supply chain network at the speed of light. In the massive Chicago distribution hub, adjacent to the headquarters, the deafening roar of industrial operations died instantly. The automated sorting machines, massive conveyor belts, processing thousands of packages a minute, violently ground to a halt. Warning sirens blared across the warehouse floor. Dispatch radios turned to static. Across the country, from the loading docks in Seattle to the freight terminals in Miami, 50,000 handheld barcode scanners simultaneously went completely black. Delivery drivers on interstate highways looked down at their mounted routing tablets in absolute confusion as the GPS navigational feeds evaporated. Artificial intelligence brain that coordinated every single movement of the Apex global empire was completely lobotomized. Back in the lobby, the confusion mutated into rising panic. Madison dropped the silver pens, staring at the flashing red screens above her. In stark, massive white letters, a single glaring notification dominated every single digital display in the building. It appeared on the projection screens, the executive tablets, the lobby security monitors, and the smartphones connected to the corporate network. The text was undeniable. Software license expired. Unauthorized use detected. Please contact Nexus Code LLC. The top executives from the international retail conglomerate stared at the glaring red message. The lead investor, a stern woman who demanded absolute operational perfection, slowly pulled her hands away from the contract on the podium. She looked directly at Devin. "What is Nexus Code?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the rising chaos of the lobby. She pointed at the 50-foot screen. Why is your entire operating system locked for unauthorized use during a contract signing? Devin opened his mouth, but for the first time since he infiltrated my family, he had absolutely no words. The smooth-talking corporate charlatan was entirely paralyzed. He looked at my father for an answer. Harrison was staring at the red screens, his face draining of all color. He recognized the name of the limited liability company. He remembered the licensing agreements I had placed on his desk every January for the past 8 years. Madison grabbed Devin by the arm. "Fix it," she hissed, her perfect public facade cracking. "Call the IT department right now and tell them to turn the screens back on. You are ruining my press conference." She was so entirely consumed by her own vanity that she could not comprehend the sheer magnitude of the disaster. She thought it was just an embarrassing technical glitch. She did not realize that the company valuation was currently plummeting to absolute zero. Devin grabbed a walkie-talkie from a nearby security guard and screamed for the head of IT. The radio was dead, disconnected from the central server. Journalists in the front row immediately pivoted their cameras away from the podium and focused their lenses squarely on the blaring red warning message. This was no longer a story about a lucrative global partnership. It was a live broadcast of a spectacular corporate implosion. Through the live feed on my monitor, I watched the lead retail executive pick up the multi-million-dollar contract from the podium. She did not say another word to my father or Devin. She simply folded the thick document in half, handed it to her assistant, and walked straight out of the glass front doors. The rest of her investment team immediately followed her out of the building. The massive deal that was supposed to validate my sister as a visionary CEO evaporated right in front of her eyes. Harrison lunged forward, desperately trying to stop the executives from leaving, but security guards were already rushing the lobby to manage the panicked crowd. The sheer noise in the atrium was deafening. Alarm bells rang from the adjacent warehouse. Reporters began shouting frantic questions at Devin, asking if Apex Global had been the victim of a massive cyber attack. They asked if the supply chain was compromised. Devin backed away from the podium, his hands raised defensively, completely out of his depth. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee. The execution was absolutely flawless. By firing me, locking me out of the servers, and forcing my exit from the company, Devin had legally severed the only bridge keeping Apex Global connected to the Nexus code architecture. I did not hack them. I did not deploy a malicious virus. I simply took back the property that belonged entirely to me. They were standing in a massive fortress, and I evaporated the foundation beneath their feet. The fake empire was completely destroyed. They thought they could steal my crown, but they forgot I built the entire kingdom alone. Down on the lobby floor, the situation rapidly escalated from a public relations disaster into a full-scale corporate apocalypse. Through the high-definition audio feed on my monitor, I listened to the regional managers screaming over the emergency radio channels. The paralysis was absolute, instantaneous, and entirely devastating. Exactly 5,000 heavy freight trucks were suddenly stranded nationwide. Drivers on the major interstates from California to New York were forced to pull onto the shoulders of the highways, their routing tablets going completely dead in the middle of their shifts. Without the Nexus code artificial intelligence calculating the load distributions, fuel efficiency metrics, and delivery windows. In real time, the warehouses were flying blind. Pallets of perishable goods and temperature-sensitive pharmaceuticals sat rotting on the loading docks. Automated forklifts stopped dead in their tracks, blocking entire distribution bays and causing massive logistical bottlenecks. The national supply chain, which I had spent a grueling decade fine-tuning to absolute perfection, was completely severed in less than 60 seconds. The global retail partners, who had just walked out of the front doors, were already on their cell phones, furiously calling their massive legal teams. I watched the lead executive stop in the exterior courtyard, her sharp voice piercing through the outdoor security microphones. She was aggressively demanding an immediate termination of all preliminary agreements and loudly threatening a massive public lawsuit for gross misrepresentation. Devin had arrogantly promised them the most advanced, seamless logistics network in the United States, and he had just delivered a multi-million-dollar paperweight on live television. Devin was practically hyperventilating on the presentation stage. The arrogant, polished executive who had so confidently stolen my position was completely unraveling before my eyes. He jumped off the stage and aggressively grabbed the new IT director by the collar of his dress shirt. Devon had hired this man just 3 days ago, systematically replacing my loyal veteran engineers with a cheaper, more compliant corporate yes man. Hack the system! Devon screamed, his voice cracking with pure, unfiltered panic. Break into the servers and force the screens back online right now. I do not care what it takes or what laws you have to break, just get the trucks moving. The IT director was trembling violently, sweating profusely under the harsh, flashing red emergency lighting of the atrium. He furiously tapped on his company-issued tablet, desperately trying to bypass the lockout screens that were blaring from every monitor. He rapidly input administrative overrides, emergency reboot protocols, and localized backdoor access codes. Every single frantic attempt was immediately rejected with the exact same blinding red notification. He looked up at Devon, his eyes wide with sheer, undeniable terror. "I cannot hack it," the IT director stammered, his voice shaking uncontrollably. "There is absolutely nothing to hack. We do not have the source code. We do not even have the server addresses anymore. Everything was hosted externally on a highly secure proprietary network. We were just running a localized front-end application to view the data, and the host just completely severed the digital connection." Harrison pushed his way through the panicked crowd of financial journalists and aggressively shoved the IT director against the podium. "What do you mean the host severed the connection?" my father demanded, his face turning purple with blistering rage. "Apex Global owns this software. I paid for this system with my own capital. Get it back online immediately, or your entire department is fired." The IT director backed away, holding his tablet up defensively like a shield. "Sir, you do not own this software," he explained frantically, desperate to save his own job. "The system is entirely registered to a third-party vendor called Nexus Code LLC. The automated corporate licensing agreement was just terminated due to an unauthorized access violation. We are completely locked out of the architecture. We are entirely locked out of our own operations." Madison shoved her way to the front of the stage. Her expensive designer dress severely wrinkled her perfect composure, entirely shattered. "Then find out who owns Nexus Code," she shrieked, pointing a manicured finger at the trembling IT director. "Look up the corporate registry right now. Find the CEO, offer them double whatever they were getting paid, and get my press conference back on track." She still thought this was a minor inconvenience that could be easily solved with our father's checkbook. She still genuinely believed she was entirely in control of the narrative. The IT director nodded frantically and minimized the blaring red warning screen on his tablet. He opened a secure web browser and quickly navigated to the Delaware Division of Corporation's public registry database. His fingers flew across the digital keyboard as he rapidly typed in the name of the limited liability company. The entire lobby seemed to hold its collective breath. Even the shouting journalists momentarily stopped asking questions, aggressively zooming their heavy camera lenses in on the small screen in the IT director's shaking hands. The search results loaded instantly. The corporate charter for Nexus Code was displayed in crisp, undeniable black and white text. The IT director stared at the bright screen, his jaw dropping completely open in shock. He looked from the tablet to Devon, then to Madison, and finally to my furious father. "Read it," Devon barked, completely losing his temper and stepping into the man's personal space. "Who is the managing director? Name the price so we can end this nightmare." The IT director swallowed hard, slowly flipping the tablet around so the three of them could see the illuminated screen. Harrison, Madison, and Devon leaned in, their eyes frantically scanning the official legal documentation. I sat in my quiet penthouse taking a slow, deeply satisfying breath as I watched the exact moment the horrifying realization hit them. It was perfectly synchronized. The blood completely drained from Devon's face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost in a custom suit. Madison let out a sharp, breathless gasp, aggressively covering her mouth with both of her hands as she stumbled backward on her expensive stilettos. Harrison simply stared at the glass screen, his eyes wide, his mouth opening and closing silently as his entire legacy crumbled into dust. They're listed clearly as the sole proprietor, the primary shareholder, and the chief executive officer of the $500 million software company that currently held their entire empire hostage was a single undeniable name: Hannah. I closed the primary monitor, plunging the high-definition live feed of the ruined atrium into total blackness. The silence of my penthouse was deafening compared to the absolute chaos I had just witnessed. I stood up from the kitchen island, smoothing out the invisible wrinkles in my tailored charcoal suit. My coffee was completely cold, but I poured a fresh cup from the carafe anyway, letting the bitter aroma fill the massive space. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the sprawling Chicago skyline. I knew they were coming. The realization on the lobby floor would immediately transition into frantic desperation, and they would do exactly what they always did. They would come running directly to me. It took exactly 45 minutes for the security buzzer near the front door to violently ring. I did not bother answering the intercom. I simply pulled up the building security feed on my smart tablet. A sleek black luxury vehicle was illegally parked on the curb downstairs. My father Harrison was aggressively arguing with the concierge in the marble lobby, waving his hands and demanding immediate access. My mother Catherine was standing right behind him, clutching her expensive handbag as if it were a shield. Madison and Devon were huddled together near the elevator banks, looking entirely disheveled and completely panicked. The concierge, heavily intimidated by my father's booming voice, reluctantly swiped his master keycard, granting them access to the private penthouse elevator. I watched the digital floor indicator climb rapidly. The heavy oak door of my penthouse practically shook on its reinforced hinges as Harrison began aggressively pounding his fists against the wood. "Hannah," he roared, his voice muffled but dripping with raw, unfiltered fury. "Open this door right now. We know you are in there. Open the damn door." I took a slow, measured sip of my black coffee. I did not rush. I walked to the entryway with the deliberate, unhurried pace of a predator entirely in control of its territory. I unlocked the heavy deadbolt and pulled the massive door open, stopping it exactly halfway. I stood squarely in the center of the doorway, blocking any possible entry. I did not step back. I did not offer a greeting. I just stared at them. The visual contrast was absolutely staggering. I stood tall in my razor-sharp business attire, radiating absolute calm and undisputed authority. They looked like the survivors of a massive shipwreck. Harrison was sweating through his expensive tailored suit, his face completely flushed with rage. Catherine looked terrified, her perfect socialite mask entirely slipping. Devon was visibly trembling, completely emasculated, and stripped of his arrogant corporate armor. Madison was an absolute wreck. Her designer gown was wrinkled, her perfect makeup was streaked with desperate tears, and she was clutching Devon's arm. Harrison tried to push past me into the foyer, but I firmly held the heavy door in place, completely blocking his path. "You are not coming inside," I stated, my voice completely cold. "You can speak from the hallway." "Are you out of your absolute mind?" Harrison screamed, completely ignoring my boundary and pointing an aggressive finger directly at my face. "Turn the system back on right now. You are destroying the family business. You are ruining decades of hard work. You are costing us millions of dollars every single minute those trucks sit idle on the highway." I looked at his shaking finger and then looked directly into his furious eyes. "I am not destroying anything," I replied with cold, surgical precision. "The family business went bankrupt 8 years ago. I am simply reclaiming my personal property. You chose to void the licensing agreement. You authorized Devon to lock me out of my own software. This catastrophic failure is entirely your own doing." Madison pushed her way to the front of the group, her face contorted into a mask of pure, self-centered agony. "How could you do this to me?" she cried loudly, stomping her expensive stiletto heel against the hallway carpet. Today was supposed to be my big day. I was about to sign the most important contract in the history of the company. You ruined my moment in the spotlight because you are jealous of me and Devon. She was entirely delusional, still viewing a multi-million-dollar corporate disaster exclusively through the lens of her own bruised ego. She genuinely believed my decade of grueling sacrifice was just a petty subplot in her grand narrative. I am not jealous of you, Madison, I said softly. I am entirely indifferent to you. Your big day was a complete illusion. You were trying to take credit for a machine you do not even know how to turn on. The exact second the real architect walked away, your fake empire collapsed. Catherine shoved her way past Madison, adopting the sickeningly sweet, manipulative tone she always used. Hannah, darling, please, Catherine begged, reaching out to touch my arm. We are a family. We can fix this. Just turn the servers back on, and we can negotiate a proper executive title for you. We can make you a partner. I stepped back, physically recoiling from my mother's touch as if it were toxic. A partner, I repeated, letting out a sharp, humorless laugh that echoed down the quiet hallway. You do not have a company to offer me a partnership in. Apex Global is dead. Without Nexus code, you are just a collection of empty warehouses and idle trucks burning through capital you no longer have. You fired me. You took my office. You handed my life's work to a con artist. Harrison's face turned a violent shade of purple. I will sue you into total oblivion, he roared. I will drag you through the courts until you are completely bankrupt. I paid your salary, which means I own that software. I smiled. It was not a happy smile. You can try. I challenged him, my tone dropping to a dangerous, quiet register. But my attorney has already filed the federal injunctions. Nexus Code LLC is an entirely separate legal entity. You have been operating on a heavily discounted lease that you deliberately breached. If you try to sue me, I will countersue for massive intellectual property theft, and I will personally ensure that every single executive board member is held personally liable for the damages. I will take your houses, your cars, and every dime in your offshore accounts. You brought this war to my doorstep, and I am going to finish it. Now get off my floor before I call building security. Harrison's mouth opened, but the booming, authoritative voice that had terrorized boardrooms for 3 decades completely failed him. He looked like a deflated balloon, his face entirely drained of the violent purple rage from just moments ago, replaced by the pale, clammy reality of total defeat. He looked at Devon, searching for some kind of corporate loophole, but his golden boy was staring at the floor, physically shrinking against the expensive hallway wallpaper. I stepped forward, crossing the threshold, just an inch invading their space to deliver the absolute final blow. The silence in the corridor was heavy, suffocating them while I breathed entirely free. Listen to me very carefully, I said, my voice dropping to a glacial, razor-sharp whisper that commanded every single ounce of their attention. You have spent your entire life confusing the vehicle with the engine. You own a logistics company in name only. The rusty trucks are yours, Dad, but the $500 million brain operating them is mine. You fired me from Apex. You have zero rights to Nexus code. You threw my belongings into a cardboard box and had security escort me out of the building. By doing that, you effectively unplugged your own life support. Madison let out a loud, theatrical sob, burying her face into Devon's shoulder, but I did not even glance in her direction. My eyes remained completely locked on my father. He needed to understand the exact mathematical equation of his ruin. You thought you could replace me with a man who looks good in a suit and knows how to use corporate buzzwords. I continued my words, hitting him like physical strikes. Devon does not know how to code a single routing command. He does not know how to bypass a localized server crash. He is a parasite who attached himself to a host, and I just starved the host. You handed my throne to a clown, and now you get to watch the entire circus burn to the ground. You have absolutely no legal standing, no operational capacity, and as of this morning, no global retail partners. Catherine could see the undeniable truth washing over Harrison. She saw the empire evaporating, the country club memberships, vanishing, the luxury vacations, dissolving into thin air. She stepped in front of my father, completely abandoning her previous tactic of sweet corporate negotiation. She resorted to the absolute lowest, most desperate weapon in her arsenal. She weaponized our blood. Hannah, please, you have to stop this right now, Catherine pleaded, her voice trembling with manufactured hysteria. Look at what you are doing to your family. Look at your sister. Madison just found out she is pregnant. She is going to have a baby. How can you be so cruel and heartless to your own flesh and blood? You are going to put your unborn niece or nephew out on the street. You are destroying a growing family over petty vindictive jealousy. I stared at my mother, feeling absolutely nothing but profound, chilling disgust. She was using a child that was not even born yet as a human shield to protect her stolen wealth. The sheer hypocrisy of her plea was staggering. I did not blink. I did not soften. Do not dare stand in my hallway and lecture me about the sanctity of family or putting someone out on the street. I fired back, my voice rising just enough to echo off the marble floors. You kicked me out of my home in the middle of the night for them. DNA is not a free pass for theft. You literally packed my bags, changed the locks, and threw me out into the freezing rain because Madison wanted the primary suite for her and Devin. You gave my bedroom to my sister so they could play house. You handed my hard-earned inheritance to her incompetent husband, and you successfully erased me from every single family photograph in your mansion. You thought I would just disappear into the shadows and let you steal my life without a single fight. You were entirely wrong. You prioritized her comfort over my basic survival. I reminded them, watching Catherine flinch at the unvarnished memory of her own cruelty. You told me I was being selfish for wanting to keep the roof over my own head. You told me a good daughter makes sacrifices for the happiness of the family. Well, I made the sacrifices. I built an empire in the shadows while you celebrated her mediocrity in the light. And now you are standing outside my door begging for scraps. The irony is absolutely poetic. Madison can raise her child in whatever house Devin can afford on his $0 salary. That is no longer my concern. My charity ended the exact second you deactivated my security badge. Harrison opened his mouth to speak again, raising a trembling hand, but I was completely finished. The conversation was over. The closure I had been seeking for 10 years had just been delivered with absolute surgical perfection. You are currently trespassing on private property, I announced, my tone reverting to the flat, emotionless cadence of a corporate executive ending a hostile meeting. You have exactly 2 minutes to get back into that elevator and leave this building before I have you forcibly removed by armed security. Do not call my phone. Do not send me emails. Do not ever show up at my home again. I placed my hand firmly on the brass handle of the heavy oak door. Direct all further communication to my legal team, I stated cleanly. Vincent is expecting your call, although I highly doubt you can afford his hourly rate anymore. Goodbye, Dad. Before Harrison could formulate a single word in response, before Madison could produce another fake tear, and before Catherine could launch another pathetic guilt trip, I stepped back and slammed the massive door directly in their faces. The heavy deadbolt clicked into place with a loud, resounding snap, echoing through the silent penthouse. I stood in the foyer for a moment, listening to the muffled sounds of chaos bleeding through the thick wood. I heard Devin shouting at Madison in a panicked frenzy. I heard Catherine weeping hysterically. I heard Harrison punching the elevator button in total devastating defeat. I turned around, walked back into my massive living room, and looked out over the sprawling city. I had completely dismantled my past, and the future was entirely mine. The rain had finally stopped, and the heavy clouds over the Chicago skyline were beginning to break. The fake logistics empire was officially dead, but the true reign of Nexus Code had only just begun. While I stood by the glass walls of my penthouse watching the morning sun finally break through the heavy Chicago clouds, the absolute destruction of my family was violently unfolding 20 miles away. I had personally designed and installed the entire security apparatus for the Apex Global headquarters 5 years ago. Naturally, I had built a heavily encrypted, undetectable backdoor into the executive boardroom cameras. I walked back to the kitchen island, opened my laptop, and accessed the live audiovisual feed. I poured a fresh cup of coffee and sat down to watch the spectacular finale of their toxic reign. The scene inside the executive boardroom was a masterpiece of total corporate hysteria. The polished, unified front they had projected at the press conference had entirely evaporated, replaced by a vicious, animalistic panic. The massive mahogany table where my father had arrogantly dismissed my contributions for a decade was covered in discarded suit jackets and frantic legal documents. Devin was pacing the length of the room like a trapped rat, his custom-tailored shirt completely drenched in sweat. He aggressively ripped his expensive silk tie from his neck and hurled it across the room. He spun around and pointed a trembling, furious finger directly at Madison. "You told me she was just a glorified secretary." Devon screamed, his voice cracking violently under the immense pressure. His polished corporate facade was entirely gone, revealing the pathetic, desperate man underneath. "You looked me right in the eyes and promised me Hannah had absolutely zero real power in this company. You said she was just an obsessive workaholic who handled the tedious paperwork. You convinced me I could fire her without a single consequence. You set me up for total failure." Madison recoiled as if she had been physically struck. She was huddled in a leather executive chair, her expensive designer gown ruined, her makeup smeared across her cheeks in dark, heavy streaks. "Do not dare blame this on me," she shrieked hysterically, her voice echoing shrilly through the hidden microphones. "You are the one who locked her out of the system. You are the man who wanted to prove how dominant and capable you were. You walked right into her trap because you are too arrogant and stupid to understand how a basic software license actually works." Harrison slammed his heavy fist down on the mahogany table with such extreme force that the coffee mugs rattled violently. "Shut your mouths, both of you," my father roared. The sheer volume of his voice momentarily silenced the room. He was pale, clutching his chest, looking a full 20 years older than he had just 2 hours prior. "We do not have time for this pathetic bickering. The legal team for the retail conglomerate just formally notified us that they are filing a $50 million lawsuit for breach of contract and gross misrepresentation by the end of the business day. The international logistics network is entirely paralyzed. Our regional partners are demanding immediate compensation for the spoiled freight currently rotting on the loading docks. We need liquid cash immediately, or we will be forced into total bankruptcy before midnight." Harrison turned to the chief financial officer, an older, terrified man who had been frantically typing on his laptop in the corner of the room. "Initiate a total emergency audit right now," Harrison commanded, his voice dripping with sheer desperation. "Liquidate the discretionary funds. Empty the executive expense accounts. Pull every single dollar we have in the corporate reserves. I need a comprehensive assessment of our exact liquid assets so we can start paying these breach penalties before the federal regulators arrive." The CFO nodded frantically and began running the emergency financial protocols. For 5 agonizing minutes, the boardroom was entirely silent, except for the frantic clicking of the keyboard. Then the CFO stopped typing. He stared at his monitor, his eyes widening in absolute, undeniable horror. He took off his reading glasses and rubbed his eyes, running the calculation a second time. The color completely drained from his face. "What is it?" Harrison demanded aggressively, marching over to the corner of the room. "Give me the total reserve amount." "Sir," the CFO stammered, his hands shaking violently as he turned the laptop screen toward my father. "The corporate reserve accounts are entirely empty. In fact, they are significantly overdrawn. The discretionary funds have been systematically drained over the past 7 days." "That is completely impossible," Harrison barked, squinting at the financial ledger. "We had millions in the offshore holding accounts just last week. Where did the capital go?" The CFO swallowed hard, glancing nervously at Devon. According to the internal routing numbers, a series of massive, untraceable wire transfers were authorized using the new executive credentials. The CFO explained, his voice barely above a whisper. Over $800,000 was moved directly into a series of offshore shell companies based in the Cayman Islands. These shell companies are historically associated with illicit offshore gambling syndicates. The boardroom descended into a chilling, absolute silence. Harrison slowly turned his head, locking his furious eyes onto Devon. Devon was frozen, his mouth opening and closing silently. The arrogant con artist had finally run completely out of lies. In his desperate attempt to cover his tracks, Devon had exploited his brand-new, unmonitored executive access to steal nearly $1 million in his first week on the job. He was not a visionary leader. He was a degenerate gambling addict, drowning in massive hidden debts, and he had used my family as a personal piggy bank to save his own life. Madison let out a guttural, agonizing scream. The absolute truth shattered her entire reality into a million jagged pieces. Her perfect, idyllic marriage was exposed as a complete and utter sham. The handsome, wealthy executive she had paraded around the country club was actually a desperate criminal who had targeted her exclusively to gain access to the Apex Global corporate vault. She fell to her knees on the expensive boardroom carpet, weeping uncontrollably, realizing she had sold her own sister out for a man who viewed her as nothing more than an easy mark. Harrison collapsed into the nearest leather chair, clutching his chest as he stared at the empty financial ledgers. The devastating reality crushed the last remaining breath out of his lungs. He had willfully destroyed his relationship with his brilliant, loyal daughter. He had handed the keys to his entire empire to a fraudulent thief. He had traded $50 million in real value for a shiny, worthless illusion. Through the monitor, I watched the great Harrison finally break, completely shattered by the devastating consequences of his own spectacular arrogance. The next 48 hours were a masterclass in total corporate destruction. By Wednesday morning, the situation at Apex Global Logistics had escalated from a localized catastrophe into a massive, undeniable national news story. The financial networks ran nonstop coverage of the unprecedented supply chain collapse. Every major news outlet broadcasted drone footage of the 5,000 Apex trucks sitting completely motionless at way stations, truck stops, and distribution centers across the country. Rival logistics firms were already sweeping in like vultures, aggressively poaching our stranded clients and charging exorbitant emergency rates to rescue the rotting freight. The sheer scale of the paralysis was staggering. The lead retail executive from the press conference made good on her very public threat. Her massive legal team filed a $50 million lawsuit for breach of contract, gross negligence, and corporate fraud. They were not just suing the corporate entity of Apex Global, they were piercing the corporate veil and naming the executive board directly. Other regional partners rapidly followed suit, terrified of being left with the massive bill for millions of dollars in ruined inventory. The legal filings piled up so quickly that the federal courts had to assign a special magistrate just to process the sheer volume of injunctions. Apex Global was no longer a functional business. It was a massive, bleeding liability completely incapable of generating a single dime of revenue. I spent those 48 hours watching the collapse from the quiet sanctuary of my penthouse, completely untouched by the carnage. My legal team, led by Vincent, had erected an impenetrable legal firewall around Nexus Code LLC, systematically blocking every single desperate maneuver they attempted. We fielded dozens of frantic calls from my father's attorneys, refusing every single temporary settlement offer. They tried threatening us, then they tried negotiating, and finally, they simply stopped calling altogether because they realized they had absolutely zero leverage. The absolute silence from their camp was deeply satisfying. It meant the reality of total defeat had finally settled into their bones. Then, exactly at noon on Wednesday, the security buzzer to my private elevator rang once again. I checked the camera feed. This time there was no aggressive entourage. There was no screaming sister or manipulative mother. There was just one man standing in the marble lobby, looking entirely defeated. It was Harrison. I was completely alone. I instructed the concierge to let him up. I unlocked the heavy oak door and opened it fully, stepping aside to let him enter my home. The physical deterioration in my father was absolutely shocking. 2 days ago, he was a booming titan of industry ready to conquer the global market. Today, he looked like a hollow ghost. His posture was severely stooped. His expensive suit hung loosely on his frame, heavily wrinkled looking, as if he had slept in it for 2 consecutive nights. His face was deeply lined with sheer exhaustion, and his eyes were completely devoid of their usual arrogant spark. He walked into my massive living room slowly, his eyes scanning the immaculate space, perhaps realizing for the first time just how successful I had become entirely without his financial assistance. He stood awkwardly in the center of the room, looking at the panoramic view of the Chicago skyline, before finally turning to face me. He did not yell. He did not threaten me with ruin. He simply stood there, a completely broken man, stripped of his fake empire and left with nothing but the devastating consequences of his own monumental stupidity. Hannah, please, my father whispered, his voice cracking with a raw, undeniable desperation. He slowly sank into one of my leather armchairs, burying his face in his hands. We are completely finished. The banks have frozen all of the remaining operating accounts. The creditors are demanding immediate payment on the warehouse mortgages, and we have absolutely no liquid capital left to cover the daily interest. Devin has completely vanished. He abandoned your sister the second the audit revealed his massive embezzlement scheme. Madison is staying at a hotel entirely inconsolable and refusing to speak to anyone, while the federal authorities are actively searching for her husband to press grand larceny charges. The $50 million retail lawsuit is going to personally bankrupt me by the end of the month. I have absolutely nothing left. He looked up at me, his eyes bloodshot and pleading. I was entirely wrong about everything. I was wrong about the software. I was wrong about Devin, and I was horribly wrong about you. I am begging you to turn the servers back online. I will give you whatever you want. I will personally fire the entire executive board today. I will publicly name you the chief executive officer of Apex Global Logistics. I will give you the corner office, the title, the salary, everything I originally promised you. Just please save my company. I stood perfectly still, looking down at the man who had actively participated in my total humiliation just a few days prior. He genuinely thought he could fix a decade of abuse and a massive corporate theft by tossing me a shiny job title. He still viewed me as an employee to be managed, a subordinate to be placated with a promotion. He fundamentally misunderstood the entire dynamic of our current reality. I do not want a job, Dad, I said, my voice completely smooth and devoid of any familial warmth. You are offering me the captain's chair on a ship that has already sunk to the bottom of the ocean. The chief executive officer of Apex Global is a completely worthless title right now. I do not want to be your employee. I do not want a salary. I do not want to sit in boardrooms trying to convince a panel of old men that my ideas hold value. I want the entire empire. I walked over to the kitchen island and picked up a massive, thick legal document that Vincent had personally delivered earlier that morning. It was bound in heavy black leather containing 200 pages of ruthless ironclad contractual agreements. I walked back to where my father was sitting and dropped the heavy document directly onto the glass coffee table in front of him. The sound echoed sharply through the quiet room. I am not turning the servers back on to save your legacy, I explained coldly. I am executing a hostile takeover. This is a total asset acquisition agreement. Nexus Code LLC is formally offering to purchase the physical assets of Apex Global Logistics, including the warehouses, the truck fleet, and the remaining customer contracts, for exactly $1. In exchange, I will personally assume the $50 million in legal liabilities and settle the breach of contract lawsuits using the capital I have generated over the last 8 years. You will surrender the entire corporate entity to me right here, right now. There will be no negotiations, no severance packages, and absolutely no golden parachutes. You will step down completely. You, Catherine and Madison, will never set foot in another Apex facility for the rest of your natural lives. You have exactly 60 seconds to read the signature page and sign your name, or I will let the creditors take your house by Friday. Harrison stared down at the heavy black leather binder sitting on the glass coffee table, his bloodshot eyes tracing the gold-embossed lettering on the cover. He did not reach for it immediately. He seemed physically paralyzed by the sheer gravity of the ultimatum I had just dropped in front of him. I checked the silver watch on my wrist. 50 seconds left, I reminded him, my voice completely devoid of any sympathy. You do not have the luxury of time. Every passing minute adds another $1 million to your liability ledger. He slowly extended a trembling hand and flipped open the thick cover. The first page outlined the primary terms of the acquisition, explicitly drafted by Vincent, to leave absolutely no room for interpretation or legal maneuvering. The text clearly stated that Nexus Code LLC was immediately acquiring an 80% controlling share of Apex Global Logistics. I was not just buying the physical trucks and the empty warehouses. I was acquiring absolute, unquestionable dominance over the corporate entity itself, leaving him with a minority 20% stake that was completely stripped of any voting rights, executive power, or dividend payouts. The purchase price was clearly typed in bold black ink, one single United States dollar. Harrison let out a ragged, suffocating breath as he read the purchase price. 80%, he whispered, the reality of the complete takeover crushing him. You are taking 80% of everything I built for a single dollar bill. This is completely insane. No judge in the country will uphold a contract signed under this kind of extreme duress. I leaned forward, placing both of my hands firmly on the glass table. It is not duress when you are the one who created the disaster, I corrected him sharply. I did not force Devon to embezzle hundreds of thousands of dollars from the corporate reserves. I did not force you to void a legally binding software license. And I certainly did not force the global retail conglomerate to sue you into oblivion. I am offering you a completely legal, highly generous lifeline to save you from federal prison. You are currently facing massive criminal charges for corporate fraud and gross negligence. If you do not sign that paper, I will personally hand over the internal server logs to the federal investigators, proving that you actively allowed an unauthorized entity to operate a stolen logistics network across state lines. He physically flinched at the mention of federal prison. The arrogant titan of industry was suddenly realizing that his bespoke suits would soon be traded for a standard-issue inmate uniform. He quickly turned the page to the secondary clauses. Vincent had ensured that the terms regarding my sister and her husband were exceptionally brutal and explicitly detailed. Read Section 4 aloud, I commanded. I wanted to hear him say the words out loud in my own home. Harrison swallowed hard, his eyes frantically scanning the dense legal jargon. Madison and Devon are to be immediately terminated with cause. He read, his voice breaking violently. Because they are terminated with cause, they permanently forfeit all severance packages, deferred compensation, and company-provided health benefits. They are strictly ordered to surrender all company assets, including the imported sports cars, executive laptops, and corporate credit cards, within 24 hours. They are permanently banned from all Apex Global facilities worldwide. Any attempt to access the premises will result in immediate arrest for criminal trespassing. He looked up at me, a pathetic attempt at fatherly pleading flashing across his exhausted face. "Hannah, you cannot do this to Madison," he begged softly, his hands shaking over the open binder. "Devon is facing grand larceny charges and has completely abandoned her. She is staying in a cheap motel outside the city. She has absolutely no money of her own. You are stripping away her cars and her health insurance right when she needs them the most. She is your sister." I crossed my arms over my chest, feeling absolutely nothing for the woman who had happily watched me get thrown out onto the freezing street. She ceased being my sister the exact moment she stood on that public stage and tried to take credit for my decade of agonizing labor, I replied coldly. She wanted to play the role of a powerful corporate executive, but she entirely forgot that real executives are held fully accountable for their catastrophic failures. She married a con artist because she was blinded by her own greed and extreme vanity. Now she gets to experience the very real consequences of her absolute incompetence. I am not a charity, and Apex Global is no longer her personal trust fund. I tapped the glass face of my watch. 20 seconds, I announced, maintaining intense eye contact. The federal regulators are currently drafting the asset seizure warrants. The retail executives are preparing a massive press release to announce your total insolvency. You have completely run out of moves. Sign the paper, step down entirely, and I will instantly reboot the servers. I will deploy the Nexus code engineers to salvage the stranded freight, and I will personally wire the settlement funds to stop the breach of contract lawsuits. You get to avoid a federal prison cell, and you get to keep your freedom. But you lose the empire forever. Harrison stared at the signature line on the final page of the massive document. He looked around my pristine, expansive penthouse, the undeniable physical manifestation of the success he had so arrogantly tried to suppress. He realized he had completely underestimated me from the very beginning. He had spent his entire life grooming Madison for a throne she was completely incapable of holding, while actively punishing the only daughter who possessed the actual genius required to maintain his kingdom. The sheer weight of his colossal failure finally broke his spirit completely. His hand shook violently as he reached into the breast pocket of his wrinkled suit jacket and pulled out a heavy gold fountain pen. It was the exact same pen he had used to sign the original incorporation papers for Apex Global Logistics 3 decades ago. He uncapped it slowly, resting the gold nib against the thick parchment paper. He hesitated for one final agonizing second, gripping the pen so tightly his knuckles turned entirely white. Then, with a defeated, ragged sigh, he scrawled his signature across the bottom line. He pushed the heavy leather binder across the glass table toward me. He did not say another word. He looked completely dead inside. The arrogant patriarch had been thoroughly eradicated, replaced by a broken, humiliated old man who had just signed away his entire life's work to the daughter he had discarded. I picked up the binder carefully, inspecting the wet ink of the signature to ensure it was completely legible and legally binding. I closed the heavy cover and placed it securely under my arm. Then I reached into the pocket of my tailored suit trousers and pulled out a single crisp $1 bill. I had specifically gone to the bank yesterday to withdraw it just for this exact moment. I dropped the green bill onto the glass coffee table directly in front of him. "A deal is a deal," I stated, my voice echoing with absolute finality through the silent room. "The transaction is officially complete. You are no longer the owner of Apex Global Logistics. Leave your company access badge and your master keys on the table right now. Take your dollar walk out of my home and never contact me again." Harrison picked up the single green bill with a trembling hand, dropping his plastic security badge and the heavy brass master keys onto the glass surface. He turned around and walked out of the penthouse, his shoulders completely slumped, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind him. The moment he was gone, I picked up the master keys. The transition of power was officially complete, but the physical reclamation of my territory was just about to begin. I picked up my phone and dialed the lead commander of the private security firm I had retained earlier that morning. It was time to clean house. An hour later, my sleek black town car pulled up to the main entrance of the Apex Global headquarters. The massive glass building looked entirely different now that I owned every single square inch of it. I stepped out of the vehicle, flanked immediately by 4 highly trained, imposing security operatives dressed in sharp black suits. We bypassed the standard security checkpoint and walked directly through the main revolving doors. The lobby was still in a state of chaotic limbo, but the moment I stepped onto the marble floor, a sudden terrifying hush fell over the remaining employees and frantic managers. They recognized the clear shift in authority. I was not the disgraced sister sneaking back into the building. I was the absolute owner, returning to conquer. The warehouse supervisors and junior executives who had watched Devon humiliate me just days prior now pressed themselves against the glass walls, desperate to stay out of my destructive path. I did not have to search long for my targets. Madison and Devon were huddled near the front reception desk, aggressively arguing with a building manager about retrieving their personal items from the executive suites. Devon was frantically trying to access a frozen corporate bank account on his tablet, completely unaware that his short-lived reign was officially over. I walked straight toward them, the heavy synchronized footsteps of my security detail echoing sharply through the quiet atrium. Madison looked up, her bloodshot eyes widening in sheer disbelief as she saw me approaching with an armed escort. She opened her mouth to scream another insult, but my lead security operative stepped forward, creating a physical, impenetrable barricade between us. I did not waste a single second on pleasantries. I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out 2 crisp, legally binding documents. I slapped them down onto the reception desk directly in front of Devon. "Those are your official termination papers," I announced, my voice carrying clearly across the silent lobby. "You are both fired with immediate cause. You have 0 severance, 0 benefits, and absolutely no rights to anything inside this building. Surrender your corporate credit cards, your executive vehicle keys, and your building access passes right now." Devon stared at the termination papers, his arrogant face draining of all color. "You cannot do this," he stammered frantically, looking around the massive lobby for my father to suddenly appear and save him. "Harrison is the chief executive officer. He will never allow you to do this to us." I smiled, a cold, predatory expression that made him physically step back in pure fear. Harrison does not work here anymore, I corrected him sharply, enjoying the exact moment his delusion shattered. I bought the entire company an hour ago for $1. I own the building, I own the trucks, and I own you. Now hand over the keys before I have my team physically extract them from your expensive pockets. Devin's hands shook violently as he reached into his jacket, desperate to comply and avoid a physical altercation. But before he could produce the keys, the heavy glass doors of the main lobby slid open again. 3 uniformed police officers walked into the atrium, their hands resting cautiously on their heavy duty belts. Devin froze completely, his eyes darting wildly toward the emergency exits. Did you genuinely think you could steal nearly $1 million from my corporate reserves and just walk away into the sunset? I asked him quietly, ensuring only he and Madison could hear the absolute venom in my voice. I audited the financial accounts the exact second I locked you out of the server network. I handed your completely unencrypted wire transfer logs, your offshore routing numbers, and your pathetic gambling syndicate communications directly to the federal authorities yesterday. You left a digital trail so incredibly wide that a child could have followed it directly to your offshore shell companies. The lead police officer stepped up to the reception desk, blocking Devin's only path of escape. Devin Vance, the officer, stated, his voice booming with absolute legal authority. You are under arrest for grand larceny, corporate fraud, and massive wire embezzlement. Turn around and place your hands behind your back immediately. Devin let out a pathetic, suffocating gasp. He looked at Madison, desperately waiting for her to defend him, to use her family privilege and loud voice to shield him from the severe legal consequences. But Madison was completely paralyzed, staring in absolute horror at the heavy steel handcuffs the officer unclipped from his belt. Devin did not fight. He did not yell. He simply turned around, entirely defeated, and allowed the officer to ratchet the cold metal cuffs tightly around his wrists. The polished corporate executive was publicly frog-marched across the marble lobby. His head hung low in absolute shame, while dozens of former subordinates eagerly filmed his humiliating exit on their smartphones. Madison watched her husband get shoved forcefully into the back of a police cruiser through the glass windows. Her perfect, meticulously fabricated life was crumbling into absolute dust right in front of her eyes. She turned back to me, her face contorted in sheer, unadulterated panic. "Hannah, you have to help me," she sobbed loudly, completely abandoning her usual arrogant posture. "I do not have any money of my own. My personal accounts were linked directly to his. You cannot just leave me here like this. I am your sister." I reached across the reception desk, completely ignoring her pathetic tears, and personally confiscated the 2 platinum corporate credit cards, sticking conspicuously out of her designer handbag. I also picked up the heavy key fob to the imported sports car she had illegally purchased with company funds over the weekend. "I am not leaving you anywhere," I replied with glacial smoothness. "I am formally evicting you from my private property. My security team will escort you to the curb. You are permanently banned from this facility, and if you ever step foot on my pavement again, I will have you arrested for criminal trespassing." Madison let out a loud, hysterical wail, dropping to her knees on the hard marble floor in a complete meltdown. She desperately pulled out her cell phone and began scrolling frantically through her extensive contact list. She called the wealthy socialite friends she had just bragged to a few days prior. She dialed the numbers of the women who had happily attended her lavish company-funded dinners and toasted to her fake success. I stood there and watched as she was sent straight to voicemail, over and over again. The toxic circle of friends who only tolerated her for her perceived wealth and her fake executive status had already seen the news of the massive corporate collapse and her husband's public arrest. They wanted absolutely nothing to do with a broke, unemployed woman crying on the floor of a lobby she no longer owned. She was entirely alone, stripped of her fake crown, and finally suffocating under the massive weight of her own absolute karma. The swiftness of the federal government was something my father had never truly respected until they arrived on his manicured front lawn. Devin had not just embezzled nearly $1 million from the corporate reserves. He had carelessly routed the stolen funds through a series of heavily monitored domestic bank accounts before attempting to push them into offshore shell companies, triggering an immediate and massive investigation by the Internal Revenue Service. because Harrison had recklessly signed over total executive control to Devon without installing a single financial safeguard. The federal auditors held my father personally liable for the massive tax discrepancies and the blatant corporate negligence. Within 2 weeks of my hostile takeover, the government placed an inescapable lien on my parents' massive opulent estate. The sprawling 10,000 square foot mansion with its imported Italian marble floors, indoor swimming pool, and pristine tennis courts was aggressively seized to pay down the staggering federal penalties. I watched the public auction live on a local news broadcast from the comfort of my own corner office. My mother, Catherine, had stood on the sidewalk behind a yellow police barricade, weeping hysterically into a designer handkerchief as ruthless real estate speculators bid aggressively on her beloved home. She watched in sheer agony as strangers walked through her meticulously decorated living room, casually appraising the crystal chandeliers and custom silk drapes she had spent decades bragging about to her wealthy friends. The auctioneer brought the heavy gavel down, entirely erasing their primary asset and leaving them with absolutely nothing but the clothes on their backs and a mountain of residual legal debt. With their bank accounts completely frozen and their primary source of income permanently terminated, my parents were violently forced into a grim reality they had spent their entire lives mocking. They moved out of the exclusive, highly secured gated community and signed a lease on a cramped, incredibly cheap two-bedroom apartment in a decaying suburban complex an hour outside the city limits. There were no valet parking attendants, no private chefs, and no daily housekeeping services. The beige carpets were heavily stained from previous tenants. The kitchen appliances were severely outdated, and the incredibly thin walls offered absolutely no protection from the noise of the neighboring units. The sudden downgrade was physically and psychologically devastating for them. But the true agonizing torture for Catherine was the complete and utter social eradication. She had built her entire identity around her elite status at the local country club and her powerful position on various wealthy charity boards. The moment the news of the massive corporate fraud and their sudden bankruptcy hit the local papers, the country club immediately revoked their membership, citing a strict morality clause in the bylaws. When Catherine desperately tried to attend a weekly luncheon with her so-called closest friends to explain her side of the story, the restaurant hostess actively blocked her at the front door, loudly informing her that her presence was no longer appropriate or desired. The powerful women she had gossiped with for 20 years completely ostracized her, turning their backs and whispering viciously whenever she was forced to shop at the local discount grocery store. They were absolute pariahs, completely exiled from the glittering world they had sacrificed their own daughter to maintain. Madison was faring even worse in the violent aftermath of the implosion. Her entire existence had been heavily subsidized by my father and violently propped up by the criminal activities of her husband. Now she was completely cut off from every single financial lifeline. Devon had been entirely denied bail due to his significant flight risk and was currently sitting in a maximum security federal detention center, waiting for a trial that would undoubtedly result in a decade-long prison sentence. He had frozen all of their remaining joint accounts to pay a massive retainer for his aggressive criminal defense attorney, leaving Madison with absolutely nothing. She was suddenly thrust into the terrifying, exhausting reality of being a completely destitute single mother. The expensive private nannies and elite daycares were immediately canceled. She was forced to pack up her few remaining belongings and move into the tiny second bedroom of my parents' cramped apartment, with her young toddler, a child she had largely ignored for years, in favor of lavish spa days and endless shopping sprees. The sudden, relentless responsibility of actually raising a child without an army of paid help was breaking her completely. Her luxury imported vehicles had been repossessed by the bank, forcing her to rely on the unreliable public bus system just to run basic errands in the freezing rain. The golden child illusion was entirely dead, replaced by the grim, undeniable reality of a woman who possessed absolutely no marketable skills, no formal education, and no genuine work ethic to fall back on. She had spent her entire life pretending to be a brilliant, wealthy executive, but without my agonizing labor and my father's stolen money, she was just another desperate, unemployed woman struggling to buy cheap diapers at the local neighborhood pharmacy. The explosive tension inside that tiny, suffocating apartment inevitably reached a violent boiling point. The toxic family structure, which had always been held together entirely by immense wealth and a shared vicious hatred for me, completely collapsed under the crushing weight of their own monumental greed. I received the full report of the final blow-up from an old private investigator I had kept on retainer to monitor their movements. Late on a miserable rainy Tuesday evening, the thin walls of their unit could no longer contain the vicious screaming match. Madison finally turned her absolute unhinged rage onto the only people she had left to blame. She stood in the cramped, ugly kitchen and viciously attacked Harrison and Catherine, screaming at the top of her lungs that they had entirely ruined her life. She blamed my father for being weak and losing the logistics company. She blamed my mother for forcing her to marry a wealthy man who turned out to be a ruthless, lying criminal. She screamed that they had completely failed to protect her from my meticulous revenge. Harrison, pushed to the absolute edge of his sanity by the loss of his massive empire and his crushing legal debt, finally screamed back. He brutally reminded his golden child that she was entirely useless, that her massive ego and her complete incompetence had directly invited Devon into their business, and that her pathetic jealousy of my software had triggered the entire catastrophic downfall. The facade of the perfect loving family shattered into a million jagged pieces on that cheap linoleum floor. They had spent a decade ruthlessly tearing me down to build themselves up, but in the end, they did not even need my help to destroy each other. They turned into vicious, starving animals trapped in a tiny cage of their own making, violently tearing each other apart for the very last scraps of their ruined dignity. I decided to let them rot in that suburban cage indefinitely. I had a massive empire to rebuild, and absolutely no time to waste on the pathetic ghosts of my past. The morning after the federal government auctioned off my parents' estate, I sat at my new desk and officially filed the corporate paperwork to permanently dissolve the Apex Global brand. The toxic, outdated legacy of Harrison Vance was completely wiped from the public registry, replaced immediately by the legal birth of Nexus Global Logistics. As the undisputed chief executive officer and the sole majority shareholder, I initiated a massive, aggressive corporate restructuring that sent immediate shockwaves through the entire national logistics industry. I deployed the newly updated, heavily optimized version of the Nexus code across the entire national network, instantly curing the devastating supply chain paralysis that had crippled the country. I ordered a complete visual overhaul of the physical assets to match the new technological standard. The 5,000 freight trucks that had sat rotting in way stations were rapidly repainted in a sleek matte black with the sharp silver Nexus Global logo. I integrated advanced predictive artificial intelligence models into every single cab, optimizing routes in real time and cutting regional fuel costs by 30% in the first month alone. The $50 million breach of contract lawsuits were swiftly and quietly settled entirely out of court, paid out directly from the massive war chest I had spent 8 years meticulously building. The brutal, unmatched efficiency of my software allowed us to successfully recover our stranded freight and restabilize the regional distribution centers within 14 short days. I completely transformed the physical environment of the company as well. The massive, oppressive mahogany boardroom table where my father and Devon had arrogantly plotted my demise was chopped up and hauled to the local landfill. I replaced it with a sleek, minimalist glass table and converted the entire top floor of the corporate headquarters into a bright, open-concept command center. The dark, secretive corporate culture of blatant nepotism, aggressive posturing, and financial embezzlement was entirely eradicated from the premises. I was not just running a traditional trucking company anymore. I had successfully merged physical industrial infrastructure with elite proprietary software, creating a massive, terrifyingly efficient tech logistics empire that was light years ahead of any remaining competitor in the global market. But a sprawling empire cannot be sustained by brilliant code alone, and I absolutely refused to surround myself with the same spineless sycophants who had blindly followed my father off a massive financial cliff. I needed a loyal, battle-tested executive team that actually understood the physical reality of the business from the ground up. My very first official act as the new chief executive officer was to personally locate every single veteran employee that Devon had arrogantly fired during his disastrous one-week reign. I picked up the phone and personally called the senior warehouse managers, the veteran routing specialists, and the brilliant junior developers who had been completely marginalized and ignored by my sister's aggressive vanity. I invited them back to the newly renovated headquarters and offered them massive, undeniable promotions, significant salary increases, and highly lucrative vested stock options in Nexus Global. I promoted Sarah, a brilliant regional logistics coordinator, who Devon had fired simply for politely questioning his physically impossible delivery schedules, directly to the position of Chief Operations Officer. When Sarah walked into her massive new corner office, the exact same office my sister had previously occupied, while contributing absolutely nothing to the company, she broke down in tears of genuine gratitude. I elevated Marcus, the veteran warehouse foreman who had silently slipped me the internal server logs during the takeover, to the vice president of regional distribution. I cultivated a fierce, undeniable workplace culture based entirely on raw merit, absolute transparency, and unshakable loyalty. There were no more golden children roaming the halls pretending to work. There were no hidden agendas, no stolen expense accounts, and absolutely no toxic office politics. We were a chosen family of dedicated, highly intelligent professionals who had survived the absolute worst of corporate incompetence, and we were bound together by a shared, unbreakable vision for the future. The people who actually did the agonizing daily labor were finally given the exact respect, power, and financial compensation they truly deserved. As the newly minted empire thrived beyond my wildest projections, and the massive record-breaking profits began rolling into the corporate accounts, the frantic high-stakes adrenaline that had fueled my revenge slowly began to fade. For the first time in my entire adult life, I was not constantly fighting a brutal war for basic recognition, nor was I desperately defending my own creations from greedy familial predators. I finally had the space to breathe, and in that newfound quiet, I discovered a profound, unshakable personal peace I had never experienced before. I began dating a brilliant, fiercely independent tech entrepreneur named Julian. He was not intimidated by my massive corporate success, nor was he threatened by my intense, relentless focus. He had built his own elite cybersecurity firm entirely from the ground up and understood exactly what it meant to fight for every single inch of ground in the cutthroat corporate world. Our dynamic was a stark, beautiful contrast to the toxic, manipulative relationships I had witnessed and endured in my own family. Julian never once asked me to shrink my personality to make his ego feel larger. He never viewed my ambition as a character flaw, and he certainly never viewed my wealth as a personal piggy bank the way Devon had viewed Madison. We operated as absolute equals, supporting each other aggressively while fiercely maintaining our own independence. We spent our evenings in my pristine penthouse, drinking incredibly expensive wine and passionately debating complex software architecture, constantly pushing each other to become sharper and more innovative. When we attended massive industry galas together, he did not try to steal the spotlight or speak on my behalf. He proudly stood by my side, perfectly content to let me dominate the room, knowing exactly who he was and completely secure in his own immense value. He respected my firm boundaries, he deeply admired my intellect, and he provided a safe, quiet harbor where I could simply exist as myself without having to constantly armor up for a brutal fight. I had successfully burned down the poisonous world that tried to bury me, and from those ashes I had built a magnificent life entirely on my own terms. 6 months after the hostile takeover, I found myself standing alone in the massive corner office of the newly renovated Nexus Global headquarters. It was late on a Friday evening, and the bustling corporate floor outside my heavy oak door had finally gone completely quiet for the weekend. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling glass windows and looked out over the sprawling, illuminated Chicago skyline. The city was an absolute masterpiece of brilliant light and deep shadows, a massive grid of relentless ambition and continuous motion. From this elevated vantage point entirely removed from the chaos of the streets below, The world felt perfectly ordered and entirely under my control. I rested my hand against the cool glass, taking a deep, uninterrupted breath. The reflection staring back at me in the window was not the exhausted, desperate young woman who had spent a decade begging for scraps of parental approval. It was the reflection of a sovereign, untouchable titan who had successfully conquered her own industry and permanently eradicated her enemies. However, the journey to this pristine altitude had not been born from a place of joy or natural ambition. As I watched the headlights of thousands of cars streaming down the distant highways, I allowed myself a rare moment to genuinely reflect on the agonizing pain of being the discarded child. For my entire life, I had operated under the incredibly naive delusion that if I just worked a little harder, if I just wrote a more brilliant piece of code, or if I single-handedly doubled the profit margins of my father's company, I would finally earn my rightful place at the family table. I had poured my absolute soul into the foundation of Apex Global, willingly sacrificing my youth, my personal relationships, and my own mental health just to keep their fragile, mismanaged empire afloat. I had desperately craved validation from people who were fundamentally incapable of providing it. Harrison, Catherine, and Madison were empty, transactional creatures who viewed love strictly as a commodity to be traded for blind obedience. They did not want a brilliant daughter or a loyal sister. They wanted a silent, obedient workhorse who would happily generate massive wealth while remaining completely invisible in the shadows of their fabricated grandeur. The psychological toll of that environment had been immense. I remembered the countless holidays spent sitting quietly at the end of the dining table, listening to my mother endlessly praise Madison for entirely superficial accomplishments, while my own massive corporate victories were aggressively ignored or casually dismissed as basic obligations. I remembered the cold, calculating look in my father's eyes whenever I dared to request actual equity for the proprietary software that was single-handedly keeping his massive logistics network from completely collapsing under its own bloated weight. They had conditioned me to believe that I was inherently unworthy of respect, that my intense drive was a character flaw, and that my only true value lay in my ability to quietly serve their insatiable greed. The memory of the day. They called me into that mahogany boardroom to strip me of my life's work, still echoed in the quiet corners of my mind, but it no longer carried the sharp, suffocating sting of heartbreak. Instead, I viewed that brutal memory with a profound sense of objective gratitude. When Madison had smirked at me across the table and Devon had arrogantly demanded my security badge, they genuinely believed they were delivering a fatal blow to my spirit. They thought that by forcefully severing my ties to the company, they were rendering me completely powerless and destitute. But their extreme arrogance had blinded them to a fundamental truth about human resilience. They had not destroyed me. They had accidentally liberated me. By violently pushing me out into the cold, they had completely shattered the invisible toxic chains of familial obligation that had kept me tethered to their sinking ship for so long. That absolute betrayal was the exact violent catalyst I required to finally wake up from my delusional hope. It forced me to look at them not as my family, but as the ruthless corporate adversaries they truly were. It forced me to weaponize my own brilliance instead of freely giving it away to people who actively despised me. The agonizing pain of being totally discarded by my own blood was the exact fuel I used to meticulously construct the impenetrable legal trap that eventually consumed them all. I stopped waiting for them to invite me to the table, and instead chose to buy the entire building and lock them permanently outside. Had they simply treated me with a baseline level of professional respect, I would have likely spent the rest of my natural life quietly managing their servers and doubling their wealth behind the scenes. Their monumental greed was the ultimate architect of their own total destruction, and my absolute refusal to play the role of the tragic victim was the solid foundation of my current empire. I turned away from the sprawling city lights and walked back toward my massive glass desk, running my fingers lightly over the polished surface. The silence in the room was not lonely. It was a rich, heavy silence that spoke of absolute victory and unshakable peace. The toxic noise of my past had been permanently muted. There were no more screaming matches, no more manipulative guilt trips, and absolutely no more sacrificing my own sanity to protect their fragile egos. I had learned the most valuable lesson of my entire life through the most brutal means necessary. I looked out into the open room, addressing anyone who has ever felt the crushing weight of being the scapegoat in a broken home. Sometimes the greatest gift toxic family members can give you is their betrayal. It gives you the perfect reason to stop setting yourself on fire to keep them warm and start building your own empire instead. Have you ever been completely underestimated by your family, only to prove them wrong in the most satisfying way possible? Share your story in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories of surviving toxic families and reclaiming your power.